I want to thank you for being part of and joining another one of our series of webinars that the Boulder Chamber has been hosting during the coronavirus crisis. I want to thank our sponsors primarily, Google, the WW Reynolds companies, the Zayo Group, and Boulder Transportation Connections. It's these partners of ours and these members that have made events like this possible and have made us able to bring these to you. This has been another one in the series of webinars that we have put together. We have put one together so far that right away engaged our membership, engaged the community members on aspects of teleworking at home. We were all thrown into this, we were all forced into it. And with our partners, Boulder Transportation Connections, the University of Colorado, and key members of ours, we quickly got to how you communicate with each other, how you work with each other. This is the next progression in that. We know that you have now the responsibility, the challenges on communicating with your customers, your clients, all those folks in the external world that are waiting to hear from you. And today we're glad to bring on some experts from our membership that will be talking about that and giving you the finer points for how to communicate with the community, with everyone out there. Whether you're a large company or a small company, there's something to hear here about those tactics, those strategies, and what you will want to consider. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce our President and CEO, John Taylor, to tell you what the Chamber has done. We're going to go into the program, and at any point along the way, if you have any questions, there's a feature at the bottom of the Zoom cast that is questions and answers. Please submit your questions there. And after our program and our speakers speak, I will go through those questions and ask those to the speakers. So I encourage you to ask all your questions there. And also, we ask you to please mute your microphones if you have not done so already. And that way we don't get additional distortion or sound or audio interference from anyone on the webcast. So with that being said, I would like to introduce our Chamber President and CEO, John Taylor. And he will go over what the Chamber has done in response to the coronavirus and everything the Chamber has been doing. John.
Thank you, Andrea, and I welcome all of you to yet another in our series of webinars on information that hopefully will help you to work your way through this very difficult COVID-19 response period. I want to just do two things. One is to provide you just a little bit of background on what we are doing to address the needs of Boulder businesses, our members, and the broader business community at large. And then second, I have the opportunity to introduce our two guest speakers who I know you will enjoy hearing from today. So first, what is the Boulder Chamber doing? To be very clear, we have two key areas of focus at the immediate moment. One is to make sure that you, as our business leaders in this community, have the information resources you need to make the decisions around your business operations and how to support your workforce during this period. So how have we done? And then the second is to make sure that we're identifying the financial resources and helping you to get access to those resources. So first, on the information resources, I want you to know that the Boulder Chamber website has a complete listing of all the best information available on everything from how do you access financial resources, to how do you support your workforce, to how do you get information on the latest status of the COVID-19 response activities. So please go to the Boulder Chamber website. Second, we have as a resource for you what we call the Boulder Area United Business Response Group. You see it listed on the slide, but that is a source of volunteer support, a source of free services or discounted services to support our local businesses during this time. It's also a place where you can post your needs and where you can make connections with folks who can help you address that. So please go to that Facebook page, the Boulder Area United Business Response Group. Third, We have an ongoing survey that is the Impacts to Business survey. That's where we ask you to go when you have specific needs. We will be monitoring your responses to that survey and making sure that we're lining up the resources to address those needs. So those are three sources of information I urge you to work to identify and to access for resource information. And the final thing I'll say is that the City of Boulder is sending out its own business impact survey this week. Please make sure to fill that out. That is an effort of all our business support organizations throughout the city. We are going to use that information to make sure we are aligning our resources effectively as business support organizations, the city, and other government agencies to address your needs. You also then want to know how to access the financial resources. Make sure that you have on your calendar tomorrow a program at 1 o'clock. It's another webinar. We will get that information to you, but that is going to be a walkthrough of the CARES Act resources available both through the Small Business Administration, but also available through our local funding institutions, financing institutions. Make sure, again, that is going to be your best resource on how to access those funding resources. So again, it's information and financial access to financial resources. We will also be providing a list of those lending institutions that are participating in the federal programs so that you have that information at your fingertips. So the last thing that we're going to be working on, which is super important, and that is starting to think about the recovery efforts. So stay tuned as we start to put in place the infrastructure to monitor and best understand where the COVID circumstances created, what is created for us, and then start to build the strategies to help support your businesses as we build out of this recovery period. So that's going to be a very important stage in this process. How do we work together to recover and help support our businesses, our economy, and our community through this period? So that's what the Boulder Chamber has been focused on. But as part of our mission during this time, we want to make sure you have resources that support you in your work. And that's what this webinar series is part of. And so we've assembled two of my favorite individuals in our community. Just as I always say, they're the international men of mystery themselves. They are just very interesting backgrounds personally, but they are experts in communicating during a crisis. And who are those? First of all, we have Bill Rigler, who is the Vice President of MAPRagency. He has 20 years of experience working in strategic communications, and rounding out the unique career path of this friend of mine, he has been the spokesman for Al Gore. He was the head of PR for Ball Aerospace, and he was in a senior leadership position with the United Nations and the Rockefeller Foundation in New York City. While he was serving in New York City, he was there during 9/11 and saw also the 2008 financial crash. So he knows firsthand how to address your audience, your customers, the public during a crisis period. He now is working, as I said, Vice President for MAPRagency. They are the oldest and largest PR firm in Boulder. And they have a deep legacy of working with Boulder firms and nonprofits on their communications needs. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, John.
Oh, welcome, Bill. And second, another dynamic individual, proud member of the Boulder Chamber and partner with us, and that's Matt Moseley, who's a partner and Chief Strategy Officer with Dovetail Solutions. I think Matt's career path is best described by him getting a call from Johnny Depp to be the spokesperson and communications director for Hunter S. Thompson's funeral and ash blast. I don't know if that's going to play into the crisis communications presentation, but gives you a sense of some of his career pathway. He was also author of Dear Dr. Thompson, Felony Murder, Hunter S. Thompson and the Last Gonzo Campaign, which I'm sure he can describe, but that was it. It was his effort to describe Hunter S. Thompson's work to address, and I'm forgetting her name, but somebody who was convicted unfairly of murder in that world. He also is a experienced long distance swimmer, first person to swim across Lake Pontchartrain in his hometown of Louisiana, New Orleans, Louisiana. So just interesting background. But since 2005, he's been in private practice as a communication strategist and consultant for many companies and organizations, working now with Dovetail Solutions, which is a political relations and policy, political strategy firm, and also works on brand development. So two wonderful experts that we've assembled for today's presentation. I'm enthusiastic about the presentation and know that we'll all learn a lot from it. So I'm going to hand it off to Matt, who I think is going to kick off this. Thank you so much, Matt and Bill, for being with us.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And it's really great to be here, and appreciate you all doing this. And I also just want to say a quick shout out to the Boulder Chamber. I don't know if you all had a chance to read this morning the article from John about this crisis and what we're all going through and some of the acceptance of grief. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later in the presentation, but it's a great example of how the Chamber is out there providing a service to their members and really showing that they care, and really building trust, which is going to be kind of central to what I'm going to be talking about today. As John mentioned, I've had a pretty diverse background. I've dealt with many crises over the years. Two quick stories. I was once a national field director at Rock the Vote in Los Angeles, and I think it was kind of really what I would consider my first crisis. We had wrapped Madonna in the American flag, naked, and she said, you know, it was a public service announcement, and she said, "You got to rock the vote, America. You got to get out there and exercise your right to vote." She's wrapped naked in the flag. Well, we find out 2 weeks after the ad starts running that she actually wasn't registered to vote herself. So that was a kind of a crazy crisis back in my younger days. And then more recently, we also handled part of the crisis for Hillary Clinton's stolen emails. We represented the server firm in that, and that was very interesting when you have the FBI knocking on your door and the New York Times calling. And so that was kind of a really fascinating kind of international crisis that did have an outcome on the elections. You know, we've all done crisis plans, I believe, if you're in our business, and with Bill, you know, for many instances, like with Excel Energy, we've done crisis plans on weather events, right? There's financial fraud for other organizations or other kinds of specific crises. I think what we're dealing with now is so broad and so uncharted in its territory that a lot of people are sort of caught off guard by it. It's like the famous boxer Mike Tyson said, you know, we all have a plan, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I think that kind of feels like what we're going through now. And I think that's a little bit what John was alluding to in his article this morning in the Daily Camera. And what I want to talk about, really, the central in any crisis is really, let's remember the fundamentals here. And that, you know, when we need to communicate, we need to be out there and we need to be very proactive. What is very important to me is to see that leadership is building trust with their stakeholders, their clients, their vendors, their employees, but they're also demonstrating empathy. And notice how I said not showing empathy, but they're demonstrating it, showing like how they care. because the one thing that people expect of leadership in a crisis is that they want to know that you care, that you are empathetic about what they're going through. And what happens in a crisis too is that we have stakeholders who have certain expectations of us. They have certain expectations about what the brand should be doing and what the organization, what the posture and the tone should be. And so good leadership really takes into account those expectations. And expectations can be set also, what's tricky is by people that are not a part of our organization, and they can be set from the outside. And so, the type of language that we're using right now really needs to build on those two factors at the very outset: trust and empathy. And it's, one of the first lessons that you learn as a writer is that you have to show, don't tell. In a story, you can't just say that I love you. You have to show how the characters love you. And that's why demonstrating empathy is so important. And that kind of gets back to John's article this morning in the paper, because it was a demonstration of empathy and showing how the chamber does care about its membership and what we're all kind of going through right now. And some of the language that we see coming out of companies and organizations is a little interesting. We see a lot of like social distancing, distance working. And while we may be physically distanced, what's more important now is social connection. And so we like to advise our clients to sort of get that distancing out of some of the language and really emphasize the connectedness of it all, and how you're connected to your customers, connected to your stakeholders or your members. That's really important in the type of language that we're using right now. And just a few examples of some of the clients that we work with. They all are dealing with, as you all are, very unique challenges to their type of business, right? So we have Kiewit Building Group, who, their sites are open, they're working, and to not be working would be a breach of their contract. So their communications about, to their internal partners and vendors is extremely, extremely important. And it's really about, the internal communications there. Excel Energy is another client I've worked with for a long time, and I think they've done a very good job in this climate right now of communicating to their customers and about what to expect from them. And I think we can all appreciate, now that we work at home, how important it is to keep the lights on, and that they do show that they care about their customers by not doing disconnects, helping people with their bills, really facilitating that. And that's some demonstrating that you care. Another client that we work with is McWhinney, and they have the dairy block down in Denver, and they also have Centera up in Loveland. And they started 3 weeks ago, right as the crisis sort of was unfolding. They started a McWhinney Cares campaign. And it's something I encourage you all to think about, is that how are you, every day they are showing something about how they care about their, the people that rent space from them, the Maven Hotel or the residents at Centera. They're showing about, their parks and trails and how people can get out on that. So there's lots of different communications. So don't think that you don't have anything to communicate, because as an organization, you should always have something. And then lastly, just as an example, we work a lot with the Colorado Education Association and their 39,000 teachers. And I'm sure all of us with kids right now can appreciate what schools mean to our lives, and that we are not good teachers, and having to deal with social learning and distance learning, and making your kids sure they're on Schoology. It's very difficult. So this is a time for the Education Association to really affirm their values about what public education means to all of us and as a society. And that it's much more than just a building. It's really about athletics and programs and the socialization that it provides to everybody. So all of these have unique different characteristics to them, but communication is really a thread that ties them all together. So, John mentioned that I worked for the author Hunter S. Thompson in the last 7 years of his life to free a woman, Lisa Allman, from prison. And there was one night in his kitchen where he asked me the strangest question. And he said, "Son, do you know the meaning of the word politics?" And I've been in politics for 20 years and I couldn't think of the answer. Was it governing? Was it policy? Was it voting? Wrong, he said. The meaning of the word politics, he said, is the art of controlling your environment. And that goes true with all of us in all of our organizations. The art of how we control our environment. And what that really means is that we want to fill the vacuum first. We want to be proactive in how we communicate, because otherwise people will define us for us in ways that we don't want to be defined. And there's a distinct term for that actually in the literature about crisis communications, which is called first mover advantage. And that is that, you want to be the ones being proactive because you then define the narrative, you define the terms of the debate, and you define the framing of how people view the initial event. And that there is a rubric in crisis communications and in the first mover advantage that says the longer the distance between the event and the response, that time frame makes it harder and more difficult to control the outcome. So that's why you want to have consistent, clear communications with all the people who really matter in your world, because that's the art of controlling your environment. And I think Bill's going to go into a little bit more about some of the tactics and some of the planning and things that you can consider there. But we take our clients through kind of an 8-step process that that you can really plan for in advance. And these are well suited to kind of what I mentioned, the very specific kinds of crises like weather events or things like of that nature. But we can also use it now. And for all the people that I just in the examples, we have taken them through all of these processes. And so it's really important that you don't jump ahead without a plan, because planning is going to be your savior here. And that's one of the most important things. Now let's talk about the media for a second. One of the things that we're finding, is that people say, they don't want to hear about anything that's not COVID related. And that can be true to a certain extent. But what we're finding is media is fairly hungry for content right now. And that they still have a paper to fill. And that sometimes I think at some point we're going to have sort of COVID fatigue where people don't really want to hear about it very much anymore. But with all the people that we've worked with, we've gotten media calls, and in any sort of crisis, there's going to be 4 questions that you need to be able to be prepared to answer before you answer that call from a media person. What happened? Who's to blame? What went wrong and why? And then how did you manage it? And so you really want to have those 4 things tight right now. And let me just say a personal word too about the media. Newspapers and media in general are having a very tough time right now. Advertising revenues are down. I just heard the other day that the Aspen Daily News may be closing because of this. They can't afford to pay their reporters. So really, this is a great time to support local media and support the Daily Camera and the BizWest and all those publications that really, provide such a valuable service to our community. The one thing about the declining media is that it gives us also a chance. The flip side of that coin is to control our own narrative. And there's a lot of different ways we can do that. Bill will talk about that a little bit more. But there are so many tools at our disposal that we can communicate with our stakeholders and control our own narrative. And one of those that's really important right now is social media. And for all of our clients who didn't really believe in the power of social media before, this is a really good time where they're opening their eyes, and we're recommending that, people are online a lot. They are hungry for information, and they are paying attention to their social media. So it's also a fact that of almost 60% of the journalists we get a call from are looking at your social media before they call you. They want to know what's happening and how you're responding. And so lastly, I'll close here with, in every crisis, there is a silver lining, and we have to look for it here. We have to, as John says, really give voice to the grief that we're feeling, but also look to a brighter day. Because the original meaning of the word crisis comes from the ancient Greek word krisis, which actually means choices. It means decisions. It means turning points. And those are both good and bad. Crises are not always a bad thing, because in this time, we have the opportunity to define our values, to reaffirm who we are, to build and maintain trust with our stakeholders and our customers and our members. And it forces us to be very clear about what we need to be doing versus kind of what we want. We can also, kind of take away all the distractions and focus on what's really important here. And then lastly, just as a note to everybody on the call, to be taking care of yourself. Because in our roles as crisis communications professionals, or whatever role you have in your own organization, we can't be the ones freaking out. We have to be the ones with clarity and making decisions based on, consistent determination of what our situational awareness is, and with empathy for our stakeholders and for others. So with that, thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to some questions. And I will turn it over to Bill Rigler.
Well, thanks a lot, Matt. For those folks who are joining the webinar, I've had the chance to work with Matt and Dovetail Solutions for a number of years, and they are the best in the business. And I think the presentation that Matt just shared is very indicative of the deep experience and expertise that he brings. So Matt, thank you very, very much for your leadership. My name is Bill Rigler. As John mentioned at the top of the call, I'm a vice president at MAPRagency. We are the oldest and largest public relations firm in Boulder, working across verticals that include artificial intelligence, aerospace, cybersecurity, cannabis and CBD. And we also do a lot of work with local nonprofits. And so a lot of the information that I'm going to be sharing today is going to be focused on very actionable tips that are working currently and are kind of demonstrated as best practices across a number of these verticals and industries. And what I want to be able to have you leave with from today's conversation is a series of steps that you can take immediately to help make sure that your crisis communications are in good shape. And not only that, but how can we help give you some tips for generating some smart public relations right now to make sure that you're continuing to meet the needs of your customers, your employees, and your other stakeholders, while also getting the word out. I want to begin first by thanking the Boulder Chamber. We are so lucky to have one of the most active chambers of commerce of anywhere in the country. And I think that, whether it was the flood, whether it was the recession, and especially now, we see that we have a chamber that is extremely responsive to the needs of its community and plays a leadership role, both in front and also behind the scenes. And so thank you to John, Andrea, to Tyler, and the rest of the team. I also want to just emphasize that a copy of this presentation will be made available after this webinar. So if anybody wants a copy of it, just please contact the chamber and they'll have the final copy. So this is a presentation that was adapted from something that our firm's president, Doyle Albee, gave in a BizWest presentation last week. And really what we're going to do here is we're going to focus on industry trends, tips you can use today. And I also want to emphasize that a lot of this information, the substance anyway, is very fast moving. That's not to say, however, that the mechanics that we're going to be talking about should change as well. What the mechanics that we'll talk about will be, again, best practices and things that you can be using right now. So let me just open up our presentation and we're going to kick off here. So again, the purpose is, what are some crisis communications and smart PR? So let's start with the obvious. Let's start with where we need you. In terms of starting with why, the reason is simple. We all get our news from different information. Some of us are on social media. Some of us follow the same people on social media. Some people have subscriptions to the news, and many don't. And so what that does is it creates an uneven playing field in terms of who's getting what information, where are they getting that information, how often are they getting that information. So for example, just about 5 minutes ago, I got a news alert sharing some very sad news, and that is that the United States has just surpassed the 10,000 casualty mark, or 10,000 deaths from COVID-19, and that came through just about 5 minutes ago. So what we want to be able to do is really think about who are the most trusted messengers to share fact-based, actionable information with key stakeholders. And according to a number of surveys and summaries, employers are considered the most effective spokespeople. And when you think about it, it really makes sense, right? Because your employees trust your company leadership to be able to talk about sales goals, other important policies, information concerning compensation and benefits. And over time, employers have established these deep trust relationships with not only their employees, but their entire networks, whether that be vendors or suppliers, donors, investors, advisory board members, and others. So this is really the key teaching, or the key moment that I would like everybody for this webinar to walk away from, is that your employees need you. Your employees are looking to you for clear, constant, calm, empathetic, and fact-based communications that can share any number of details, whether that's related to COVID-19, whether that's partnering with local public health officials to reiterate or to inform urgent public health warnings. And now that we're starting to see a new phase with the economic recovery and the stimulus packages, more information for them that they're going to want to hear about in terms of will they still have a job? Will there be layoffs? Will there be furloughs? What happens to my benefits? So all of these are moments that call for your leadership right now. And one thing that I've listed on the slide here is that we want to make sure that you're using your platforms to inform, to soothe, to empathize, and to do so at a regular frequency. What we see time and time again, especially in times of crisis, is that somebody will say, oh, well, I put this on Twitter 2 weeks ago. I've already said that. The reality is that in a crisis situation, the communication needs to be extremely frequent. And so you may want to think about what's right for your business, but to be communicating out with your key stakeholders at least twice a week is going to be very, very important.
Hey, Bill, I'm just getting word that your slides aren't showing, so you may want to just make sure the slides are up and you're sharing your screen. Right now, they're seeing you on camera.
Oh, thank you very much, Andrea. Okay. Good. Okay. Thank you for that. Sorry about that, folks. So another thing that we think is really important to share is that leadership involves connection through communications, and several surveys are now showing that employees and stakeholders are expecting regular communications. The statistic on this third bullet point is that 63% of employees are expecting daily updates, with 20% wanting updates coming several times a day. So this is really important in terms of understanding this giant vacuum with information that your customers are looking for. And so we want to make sure that information is always coming from you, because you are the most trusted person to share that. And there's also a business rationale around here as well, right? And that is that, again, in another survey published from Edelman, which is one of the largest public relations firms in the world, they did a global survey last week showing that among current and potential customers of businesses, those customers are more likely to want to purchase and continue purchasing products and services from companies that they know are speaking out about COVID proactively. So if you're looking for a business rationale to be more proactively speaking out, this is it. You want to be able to get more customers to you. And the last line, and this is just something I want to share from what we've been hearing from public health officials, is that again, because there is such uneven information distribution around public health announcements, stay-at-home orders, asking people to model best practices with wearing face masks, please use your company platforms, whether that's email, social media, your LinkedIn, your company's Slack. Use this to make sure that everybody within your network has the same access to public health information, because at the end of the day, we're trying to stop a pandemic, and your leadership is needed more than ever. So with this in mind, let me give you just a couple of examples of some best practices from crisis communications. And again, we're drawing these best practices on what we've been seeing from a host of different industries, and we think that they play out well here. So, and this is one of the things that Matt had discussed as well, but one of the first thing that we recommend is actually have a written crisis communications plan. Don't sacrifice the good for the perfect. Don't make it extremely long. Know that it's going to change, but you want to include a couple of key details. And for example, that's going to include who is in charge of crisis communications. What are the 3 contingencies that you are most scared of that you want to make sure that you have a communication at least drafted? Who are the decision makers on those communications that you have? And then finally, think through what are the layers of approval and what are the distribution channels that if you indeed do have a crisis, how are you going to get that news out? In our experience, having something as simple as a 1-pager is very, very helpful in this regard. But I think that the important thing is to have it and hopefully not need it, as opposed to having a situation where one of your employees or your CEO is found to have been confirmed positive with COVID. What happens then? Let's make sure that there's a standard playbook that everybody knows about. The next bullet, I think, is something that's extremely important. And as John mentioned at the top of this call, I was in New York City during 9/11 and also during the financial crash. And, I'm not prone to making comparisons between Rudy Giuliani and Jared Polis or Andrew Cuomo, but they do have one thing in common. And that is that in times of crisis, they gave daily briefings. And this is something that Governor Cuomo and Governor Polis are doing exceedingly effective now, but they're giving daily updates, briefings, where they're sharing what they know. They're doing so with honesty. They're doing so with empathy, and they're making clear what they know and what they don't know. And so we're not suggesting that for every person on this call to institute a daily, but at least think about moving to a twice weekly format where you're at least updating your customers and consumers, as well as your employees and other stakeholders. In terms of what you share and what not to share, a lot of that is going to be up to you. But what you should be sharing on a frequent basis, again, is going to be public health messaging. It's going to be information on economic recovery and other stimulus programs that would be beneficial for everyone to know, whether that's unemployment benefits or something else. And remember that at the end of the day, what we really want to do is, let's recognize that this is a scary time and a scary place. And so the more that we can do to demonstrate that we're all in this together, and that comes through communication, the better that we're going to be. 2 other points on here. One is that we want to make sure that we're consistent across all of our owned media. And so when we talk about owned media, these are the things that you have directly under your control. So for example, that's your website, it's your social media platforms, it's your MailChimps and email programs. And it's also any other vehicle that you have to reach out to your stakeholders. So at a minimum, you're going to want to make sure that any disruptions or pivots in your products or services are reflected uniquely around each of those platforms. Again, not everybody is going to get their news in the same way. So you're going to want to make sure that your communications reflect meeting people where they are rather than you want them to be. And then lastly, monitor this like your day job, because it is. Again, what we're seeing is that the news and information is changing faster than newspapers and Twitter can keep up. And so it's your job as the leader of your enterprise to make sure that you're on top of this and then you're able to communicate that out. When I was mentioning the communicating at least twice a week, one example that I have with this is that the Boulder Homeless Shelter, right, which is working with one of the most high risk, most vulnerable populations in our county has started for the first time ever advertising and sharing information related to admissions, the amount of people that it's been serving, the amount of referrals that it's been given to the recovery center for individuals showing symptoms. And it does so for a couple of reasons. One is that the longer term impacts of being able to share this information now at a time when more information is needed than less. So being able to share that information with policymakers, with public health officials and others, both demonstrates a commitment to transparency in the interest of public health, but it also demonstrates that they're doing their part to inform the people who need to know, to let them know that they're doing all that they can to shut down the spread of COVID. If your company has a similar opportunity to do so, I would say please take advantage of it. So a couple of things in terms of how do you set up your own crisis communications design. The first is, again, make sure that you actually have a written crisis communications plan. Just determine who your focal points are going to be, determine what the guardrails around messaging will be, determine also what are the 3 contingencies that you want to have at least some communications drafted around. So for example, if you have an employee that is identified as positive, what disclosures are you required to make legally and ethically to your stakeholders? What are you allowed to talk about, given HIPAA rules and privacy? So to the extent that you can have that figured out sooner than later, you'll get a lot more peace of mind from it. The other thing that we really want to encourage you to do is that what happens if you're called by the Denver Post or BizWest or Denver Business Journal about your program or about your company or about your products? Are you ready? Do you know what you'll say? So being able to have specific messaging in mind is really going to be important. And again, it should never be a no comment, because in our experience, saying no comment only adds fuel to the fire. Make sure, again, that your comments are helpful, that they're timely, that they're informative, and actionable. One of the other elements just for crisis comms then this is something that Matt had mentioned as well, is that it is absolutely critical to activate your social media. Numerous studies, including Pew, show that a majority of American adults receive their news from social media. So if you've been looking for a time to activate Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, this is absolutely the time to do it. And so it's also a great force multiplier in terms of your traditional marketing or PR channels. So to the extent that you can make sure that your messaging is being repeated across social media and at frequency, that's going to be great. And then finally, just make sure that you're updating all of your own media properties. Every business now has stay-at-home policies. So do you, for example, have ways for your customers to contact individuals at your company if they're not going through the main line? Is it clear that your business is still open? Do you have the hours of operation adjusted? If that information is not being shared uniformly across all of your platforms, this is the time to do it. And please make sure that you're able to do that. So now I want to pivot a little bit to just talking about, so how do we get public relations at a time like this? At least in Boulder, we're seeing a lot of companies that are doing their best, whether they're in the service industry or food and beverage, or even SaaS and tech firms. And so this is really where we want to talk about how can you start generating some good public relations to remind customers that you're still open, that you're still working, and that you're still accepting their money. So the first thing that we want to talk about is make sure that your articles or that your pitches are related to the COVID-19 scare. We have been working with journalists over the last 3 weeks from all around the country in at least a dozen different industries. And what we are hearing routinely from journalists is that they simply don't have the capacity to cover things that are not directly related to COVID-19 at this point. So I think some of the examples that I would point to, for example, is that here in Boulder, we have several businesses that, including Tiaco, that's run by Peter Waters, where they're actually soliciting, they're taking orders for grilled cheese sandwiches and tacos, and they're delivering those for free to frontline health workers. A similar initiative from Kyle Judah at CU Boulder and Vikas Reddy has been working to solicit funding and purchases from local restaurants that's also being used in partnership with Boulder Community Hospital. So the reason why these are such stories is that, again, there's the COVID connection, but it's also demonstrating how people are coming together to do this. Oh, and by the way, the flip side for these restaurants that are participating in these programs is that they get to continue to have revenue streams, they get to continue to employ their employees, and they're continuing to make delicious food. Something that at the end, when we come out through the back end of this, we're all going to want to have those restaurants in place. The second thing I want to talk about with PR is that PR does not mean press releases. PR means public relations, and that takes many, many forms. So, for example, public relations can be like the example that I gave with the frontline health workers just a minute ago. That can be your business partnering with charitable activities to deliver foods or services to frontline health workers. Public relations can mean that if your business has unique insights into how businesses or employees can access the Paycheck Protection Program or the PPP under the CARES Act, consider doing a 500-word blog on LinkedIn or on Medium that you can then share. You can also think about using branded social media graphics. Western Disposal, for example, has been labeled an essential service by the Department of Homeland Security. And so all of their workers are moving forward every single day to work with all of the commercial and residential customers. One of the things that they've done was create a branded social media graphic that lists what to throw away, what to recycle, and what not to in order to reduce the spread of transmission. And what's been great about this graphic is that it's been branded as Western Disposal, and properly so, but it's received over 1,000 shares, and it's been posted on various municipal social media pages. It's been shared on the company's owned properties, which include Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. It's been posted on Nextdoor. And so not only is that information being very helpful, but again, it's this very soft extension of getting the brand out there. One of the things that we need the most right now also is just stories of inspiration and good information. So some of you, for example, might have seen all of the do-it-yourself mask construction efforts and videos. Those are things that are great opportunities for companies to put their name on. So if, for example, one of your employees is showing how to make a mask, have it be a branded piece of cloth or something from your company. Recycle or reuse polo shirts to help people that have your company's brand on them to do that. Lots of different ways to do this. And also at the end of the day, we really want to make sure that you're not profiteering. So to the extent that you can find clever and subtle ways to get your brand out there, do it, but it shouldn't be at the expense of it. And then just the last point on this is that rethink what's newsworthy. This is not the time to announce new product rollouts. This is not the time to be sharing information that's completely unrelated to COVID right now. So rethink what you do. And I also just want to build on something that Matt had mentioned as well, and that is that our newspapers are struggling right now. And they absolutely need our continued support. And so even within Colorado, we have the Daily Camera, we have Shea Castle's Boulder Beat, we have BizWest, the Denver Post, the Denver Business Journal. If your company is interested in appearing in any of these publications, please do us all a favor and make sure that you have a couple of subscriptions to each of these publications. We want to make sure that these publications continue to have the bandwidth and the staff to be able to continue doing the work that they do, because at the end of the day, we all have a vested interest, but companies especially, in making sure that journalists are continuing to do their job and these stories can continue to run. Because without these papers, we won't have public relations. So I mentioned a few of these earlier, but there are a couple more examples that I think are so spot on, and I just want to be able to share these to give some examples. So the first is a company called Daydream Apartments in Denver, and for those of you not familiar with Daydream, they're located right near Union Station and share the space with Whole Foods. So again, following this example of near daily communications, Daydream was one of the first companies that we had seen that came out in front with near daily written, emailed, and printed communications for all of their key stakeholders. There was a really strong why that was wrapped around their communications. And for Daydream, it was for the health, safety, and experience of their customers and the health and safety and experience of their employees. And so what they were able to do was have daily communications, and again, in many cases printed out, that they left on their residents' doors, explaining what it meant to have these stay-at-home orders, what it meant to have different amenities being closed or shut off, how and why the company was responding in the way that it did. And most especially, the company has just been, again, just a national model of helping to explain what individuals facing financial hardships can do. So again, what we're really seeing is that daily or near daily cadence with a lot of consistency, with a lot of empathy. And one of the benefits from this, I think, is quite clear. There was somebody on a Facebook page had said, well, why don't we just do a rent strike here at the building? And several of the additional residents jumped up and said, are you kidding? Look at the level of service we're getting. If we're not continuing to pay for these services, think about how much worse it could get. And as an employer and as a business, that's kind of the stance that you want to be, is to have people defending you for all the great work that you're doing. I mentioned the Western Disposal example earlier, just in terms of, again, really low-lying PR, but ways to get your brand out there and have it associated with good. Another example that we would draw from is that with the federal stimulus package, with the $2 trillion coming in the way, with talk of additional legislation coming out, several of the nonprofits that we work with, including Protect Our Winters, is developing a thought leadership piece for publication in the Wall Street Journal or New York Times to talk about the importance of not taking our eye off the ball with climate change and making sure that we're continuing to invest in renewable energy technology as part of this, the largest single federal stimulus package that this country has ever seen. And then lastly, I just wanted to make sure that I'm addressing a couple of points, and just to build on what John had said as far as the financial assistance programs. The first is something called the COVID-19 Financial Assistance Network, and this is being co-sponsored by the Foundry Group here in Boulder with a local connection of CFOs called Lose List rather. And what they're doing is providing pro bono cash management, financial assistance, and cash flow financial services to companies who need them. Likewise, Simple Startup is another firm that's providing really rapidly evolving information on accessing the PPP, best cases and strategies for cash management, so that companies who have maybe a 30-day window on what their cash projections look like can actually bring some informed decision making into that process. So finally, I just want to recap here, and then Matt and I look forward to your questions. The first is that leaders lead, and they do it through frequent, empathetic communications. The second is have your communications plan in place and have it written down. Third is activate all of your own channels. That includes social media and your website. Generating smart PR by making it COVID-related, sharing thought leadership examples on LinkedIn, discussing your pivot in services or products, and making sure that you're emphasizing how that's relevant to COVID-19. And again, remembering what your customers want to hear, which is dramatically different from sharing what information you want to say. And then just the last point is the dynamics are changing. So even if your messaging is changing, the frequency that you communicate should not. The empathy that you communicate with should not. The information that you share should not. So with that in mind, I just, again, my great thanks to the Chamber. Thanks to all of you for coming today, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Bill. Tyler, if you could just start my video. All right, we do have a question in from somebody that posed it. And their question is, that we think many of the organizations are likely already experiencing the fatigue of communicating COVID assistance. What is the best way to communicate when an audience is likely over the message you're providing? Matt, why don't you take that first, and then Bill? And just as a reminder, we only have 5 minutes for questions and have another couple. So Matt and Bill, real quick, what do you recommend when your audience is experiencing fatigue over communication on COVID?
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. I did mention that a little bit in my talk about how that media seems to be pretty hungry for content, and that at some point we are going to be experiencing kind of COVID fatigue. But I think the important point to remember is that all of our communication should just, it sort of tie into the issue in one way or another. What are we doing about this to show that we care about our employees, or some service that we're offering to our customers, like Excel doing, they're not going to do any disconnects at this time. So just things like that you can relate, that are, useful information. The second thing I would add is that it's really important to have communication protocols set up right now, and how and when you do respond and who is doing the response. Very important before any of the crisis begins. Bill?
Yeah, Matt, I think that's exactly spot on. And thank you to the questioner, because this is something that we get a lot. So, I got an email this morning from the Container Store, for example, telling me what they were doing to make sure that everybody was safe. I don't think I've shopped at the Container Store in 15 years. So, not all communications are equal. And so I guess that my advice here would be that I think there's a couple of things. Number one is that, you want to try and find the sweet spot between what are the things that you want to say versus what do your customers want to hear. If you think that your customers want to hear that all of your employees are washing their hands, I would challenge that. But if you think that your customers will want to hear, here are the 3 ways that we're modifying our service hours, here are the 3 ways that we're staying open, here are the 3 ways that we're making sure that we're able to continue our service to you, that's important information that deserves to be shared. I guess the second thing I would say here is that not all information is considered equal and needs to be shared equally, right? So like I said, I think that, public health messaging, not everybody is getting their information on this in the same time, in the same way, or from the same sources. If you see public health information that's coming out, share that with your employees in internal emails, on Slack, and share it on social media. If you have specific information about new products or services, share that across all of your channels. But I think the important thing to do is to remember that with this frequency, you're constantly reminding people that, hey, I'm still here, we're still open, and we're still doing work. It's not enough to have a post 2 weeks ago saying that these are our extended hours, because people have long since forgotten about that. So having that frequency in communication and messaging and making it useful is going to play all the difference.
We got another question. And first of all, we have a lot of different kinds of companies. We have solo individuals, entrepreneurs, folks that are more tech savvy, folks that are less, folks that are have more resources, some that have less. And they're all just trying to figure out what to do here. Matt and Bill, and we'll start with Bill and then go to Matt. If you had one key takeaway for maybe a small business with limited resources, and one key takeaway for a large employer with abundance of resources and capacity, what is the number one thing that you would like them to know from what you've communicated here today? Start with Bill and then go to Matt. And we're running up against time, so just quick.
The number one thing to know is that you have a lot of communications tools at your disposal, whether that's LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, email. Make sure that you're going out with frequency, and make sure people understand that you're there to help them communicate with honesty and with empathy.
Great, and that applies to both large and small. Matt?
Yeah, I'm gonna, very similar. And I started out my talk by saying, and illustrating the importance of building trust, maintaining trust in your brand and in your organization, and then demonstrating empathy through all of your communications and showing that you care. That the biggest expectation of our stakeholders is that they want to know that we care and we're doing something about it.
Great, thank you, Matt. Another question has come in and asked if this presentation will be available to members after the webinar. It will be, and it will be on boulderchamber.com. With that being said, I want to also let you folks know that there is an abundance of resources on the Boulder Chamber's website. I would like to thank Matt Moseley and Bill Rigler for being here today, for providing this information to our members. I would also like to thank the sponsors that made today possible. That's Google, the Zayo Group, WW Reynolds Company, as well as our partners at Boulder Transportation Connections that are constantly putting out resources and webinars as well. So don't forget, tomorrow we have a webinar with the Northwest Chamber Alliance on how all businesses can access resources that are available, and it will be a federal funding assistance walkthrough with a small business development company, corporation here in Boulder. And thanks again. This will be recorded on the Chamber website. Bill and Matt, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Have a great day in the Flatirons.